doing this thing where I squirm in my chair. Does that make that stop? Hey guys, it's Kara. I'm back for another video, and everybody wanted to hear about outlining. And outlining is something that is for some people and is not for some people. But I do want to say that in this video, before I dive into everything, that if you decide to outline, there is no actual wrong way to outline. If you find a method that works really well for you and it helps you stay on pace and it's a system that works, then you're good to go. I wouldn't really bother with trying to find like the perfect method of outlining, because there is no perfect method due to the fact that individuals are unique and something that works for me doesn't always work for you. I feel like I have to say this at like the start of every video. Before I get into outlining, I do want to talk about the different types of writers. Like at some point we all talk about these people, but you've got your plotters and then you've got your pantsers. So your plotters are the people who like to kind of plan everything out in advance, know what's going on in their story. Some of them go into really excessive detail and some of them just do like maybe a one-page summary. Then you have your pantsers. Your pantsers are the people who kind of write it as they go. Both of these have pros and cons. So the one thing that plotters have that's going for them is they don't really suffer from writer's block as much in the actual process of writing because they've already planned it out. They have a very different problem. So for example, some plotters actually get too focused on the outline and they don't want to deviate from it. The idea of deviating from something that they've already established is very terrifying for them. And then the other thing that's a con for some people is that they already know the ending, which kind of goes where I'm leading into the pantsers thing. So pantsers literally just kind of write as they go. They're figuring out the story and they're like exploring it and they're finding emotions and they're just really in the heat of the moment. It has a very organic development and there's almost like I've been told it's a magical experience when things just kind of unfold onto themselves, and I can see the appeal of that. But however, there is a couple of cons that go with that too. One is overwriting. I know some pantsers do a lot of overwriting. There is the writer's block because you're sitting there and you're trying to figure out what's going to happen and you don't know. And you may not know because, you either don't know the sequence of the stories or you don't have enough information to pull from and you have to stop the whole writing process. Then the other thing that kind of sucks when you are a pantser is the rewriting process. I talked about overwriting just a little bit ago, but sometimes there's things that happen in the story that don't actually like fit into the story and you end up having to take it out, and it can be a process on itself. However, I am not an actual pantser myself, so these aren't things that I've experienced. What I'm talking about are things that I've seen that's happened to individuals who are pantsers that come to a writing group. Now that I've gone ahead and I've kind of explained the difference between plotters and pantsers, we're going to go ahead and put pantsers to the side and we're going to focus on plotters. So when you're plotting novels, there's so many different ways that you could outline, and there's a lot of different software that you can use. I'm not talking about software in this video. If you want me to talk about writing software, that's probably a future video. There's a whole bunch of different ways to actually go ahead and outline your novel. I'm going to go ahead and list off the main ones right now, and if you decide that that's something for you, I will have some links with examples down below for you, so you can go ahead and you can check those out whenever you want. The very first method is the traditional one. That's where you basically do the chapter summaries about what happens. The pro to that is it's very easy to do. The con is that sometimes you can get really carried away with the actual writing itself. Next method is going to be the snowflake method. Snowflake method is basically where you start with one little tiny detail and you kind of expand outwards into greater detail. The pro to that is that it allows you to start small and expand outwards. Bad news is sometimes you expand too far. Then there is the Act 3 model. The Act 3 model outline is mostly conflict kind of focus, where you're basically watching the rising action, the climax, and then the falling action. Pro to that is that it's pretty easy to kind of follow because all stories have a rising action and a falling action, but the downside to that is that when you're following that kind of format is that you're not looking at other things like world building and character development, and that's stuff that you have to do extra on the side. The other one, and it's a very popular one that I see a lot of people using, is the hero's journey, where you basically start off in the ordinary and then you get a catalyst, and it's a whole circle of how it works. And a lot of stories naturally follow a lot of aspects of this outline. However, I think it's a good traditional model for people who are new to writing to kind of look at and get a feel for. The con for that is that it is very restrictive because it's basically like you start in the normal and then something happens, and then while you're running away from the thing that happens, you run into the helper, and it just goes on from there. There's another one that I've been hearing a lot about, and it's to Save the Cat, and this is more like a formula than an outline, but I did read the book about Save the Cat for novels. Originally it was made for screenwriting, and it followed like the formula is actually really sound, where it's like you spend 20% of your book in this, and then 10% here, 5% here, and 50% here. And I would really recommend that for people who just don't know where to start. there's nothing wrong with using a formula when you're first moving out and then branching out of that. Another one, and this one's not very well known, but it's the story grid. I can't really say enough nice things about the story grid, especially if you're an OCD person. So even though there's a book out for the story grid, the author actually has all the videos and the tutorials up online. So that way, if you actually want to take a look at it and see if it's for you, you can go ahead and you can just watch that. I have the book because I wanted to support him, because he really did give back to the community that way. The pro with using the story grid is it gives you a really good bird eye view of everything that's going to happen. Like, I'm talking like this thing breaks everything down into like the tiniest detail. The con is that it takes time to do. And if you're okay with spending a couple of weeks up to a month working on your outline, then that's the method for you. But it talks about like a whole bunch of different things. Like, it talks about like the polarity and the changes and the purpose of scenes, like it just, and you know, word count, like everything. Like, this thing just like, if you're the type of person that likes to break everything down into fundamentals, that's for you. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the actual outlining process itself. This is the outlining process, and according to me, this is what works for me. This is what allows me to actually create stories and basically kind of streamline the process. It's not perfect, it's not best, some of it's overkill, but this is just what I do. If you look at it, you see that there are elements of it that you like, then I will be more than happy to, like, you can use those, go for it. The whole point of me having this video is to kind of show like a different way of doing it and seeing if it appeals to you. So when I outline, I do a little bit of the traditional combined with the story grid. I don't do too much of the story grid because, like I said earlier when I was talking about it, it is very overkill in some areas. I think it's fantastic. Just some of it, like, I just don't need to know. I don't need to know about the polarity and things like that. Mostly because story grid is very focused on kind of like criminal fillers, and I write urban fantasies. And the reason I use those two methods in combination with each other is because it allows me to see problems and fix them before they even happen. And then that way, when I actually start the writing process, it's pretty easy. Like, I wrote my whole second book in 4 weeks. So anyway, I'm not going to talk about the actual writing process. I'm going to backtrack and I'm going to talk about the outlining. Now, first things first, I'm going to let you guys know it takes me a month to actually outline whatever book I'm working on or whatever book I'm focusing on for the outline. And I don't just spend a whole month just focusing just solely on making an outline. I'm usually doing something else. So for example, at the time that I am recording this video, I am outlining book 3. Yeah, I'm outlining book 3 while I'm doing edits for book 1. And the reason I do it that way is because sometimes my brain needs a break from one and the other. So the step 1 for me when I go ahead and I'm about to go and do an outline for a book is I do a thought bubble. And the reason I do a thought bubble is because there is a lot that's going on inside my head, and I need to take that out and I need to put it on paper. And it is actually scientifically proven that if you take something and you write, it stimulates different parts of your brain, and it allows you to focus a lot more and remember things. So I put everything on the thought bubble, and then once I have everything on the thought bubble, I start to connect everything where it is. And if I have something that doesn't fit with with 2 or more things on the thought bubble, I cut it out. Because the last thing I want is fluff in my novel. Second thing that I do is I do the actual outline itself. Now, I do outlines by scenes because it allows me to see what's gonna work. And a lot of times, like after I finish doing the scene outline, I'll realize that there's a scene I wrote in the 3rd act that really should belong in the 2nd or maybe even the 1st act. And it's a lot easier for me to go ahead and move it by scene than moving chapters around. So when I'm writing the actual scene synopsis, I usually put in anywhere between 2 and 5 sentences about what's happening. I don't go into a whole lot of detail. Sometimes these are bullet points. And the reason I don't do that is, and if you remember from my intro video about me being a new author here on YouTube, I said that I am 80% plotter and 20% pantser. And there are times when I'm actually in the writing process where what's happening inside my head is going to deviate from my outline. And and you can usually know in that moment if it's going to be better than what you planned, and I just go with the ride at that point. So I don't make my outline so concrete that I have to follow I have to absolutely follow it, or deviating from it's going to destroy the whole story. So leaving scene descriptions vague in that sense actually helps me out a lot. The third thing that I do is then I actually start to break all my scenes down into really big detail, which is where I start using the story grid. I'm probably going to put it right up here. This is a grid that I use where I break down everything in order to see if the scene is actually going to be needed, if it's purposeful, and if I need to change it. So I'm looking at a whole bunch of things like what's the purpose of it, how many characters are in the scene, where are the characters off scene, what are the elements of the scene, and should I bother keeping it. I also track location. I also track time at this point, because one of the things that my editor over at 8 Little Pages said, she's like, it feels like everything in your story takes place within like 3 days. And that was really important for me to know, because in my brain the whole story took place over 2 weeks, but I didn't convey that right. So knowing locations and times kind of helps me remember that, and then find ways to kind of like show that there's time passing. And I want to backtrack to tracking when your characters are on set and off set. The reason I want to touch back on that is something that when I was getting my book edited for the first time by Jamie, one of the feedbacks that I got is I had stagnant characters who basically only animated when my main character came into the room. So like they were only there to kind of like either push the plot or be like helpful in that sense, and they didn't actually have like their own things that they were going on, that were going on. But if you have a character that only does something when your main character comes into the room, then you need to check that out. So if you have a character that's going to be reoccurring, like they're going to pop up a couple of times, it's really important to know what they're doing. So for example, in my book, I have a character named Vanya. And Vanya, when I first wrote him, only did something when Ghost came into the room. He didn't have his own agenda. He didn't have things that he was actually working on. Or rather, he didn't appear to have things that he was working on. So when I did the rewrite, I definitely made it clear that he was researching things and that he was looking into something, and then he would make inquiries to Ghost about like, you know, hey, did you go check out this thing? I need to know. But if you have like a character that's only kind of showing up like, you know, once in the story, then you don't have to worry so much about that. And going back to, you know, Queen of Swords and Silence, I have a character named Carl, and Carl is only going to appear once in the story, but he's part of the world building. But he's going to be a reoccurring character throughout the series, just not in the book. So I don't really worry too much about what Carl's doing. But I do worry about, for example, what Vanya's doing, what David's doing, what Bab is doing. And then I want to go ahead and I want to backtrack to when you're analyzing plot points. So when, not gonna lie, when I wrote my first book, I totally pantsed the entire thing. And then I found out that pantsing wasn't for me when I finally decided to sit down and tear apart the whole book after my first edit review. And one of the things that I did was I actually sat down, and if you guys remember when I was talking about villains and I talked about how I completely tore my villain apart, that was nothing compared to how I tore my entire book apart. Like I really, like this was when I got into StoryGrid and I actually broke everything down trying to figure out what was working in my story and what was not. And one of the things I saw is that I had like an Excel spreadsheet, and I broke down everything, and I even broke down like all the subplots. And one of the things I noticed is that I only have one subplot. It was the series subplot. It's the subplot for the entire series, but it only made like a little tiny cameo in my book, and it was like it kind of came and then it went, and you never heard about it again. And I remember looking at it and I was thinking, you know what, like if it's not going to be a dominant part of this book, I probably don't need it. I can probably hint at it, and I did that. I put like a little tic tac hint in the book that kind of leads to that coming in the future. But when I saw that was only like a little tiny feature, I just cut that right out. I was like, you know what, don't need this fluff in here right now. If it's gonna, like, it doesn't even really do anything until book 3, so I'm just gonna focus on that when I get a little closer to it. The other thing that comes to when I'm analyzing and breaking it down like that is I also make a to-do list. And the to-do list is things that I either need to research, pictures I need to find. So for example, when I was writing my first book, part of my book actually took place in Louisiana. I've never been to Louisiana, I've never gone there, I've only heard about it. And so on my to-do list, I had to sit down and write down things like research Louisiana, find out restaurants, what kind of things. Like I watched a lot of documentaries about Louisiana, I looked up the culture, the history, in order to that way when I was actually going to write it, I could portray it better, because the one thing that we all hate is when people write shit and they don't know what they're talking about. Fourth thing that I do, and this is just a me thing, if this isn't something that you're like totally into doing, then don't do it. But the fourth thing that I do is I actually kind of bounce my outline off of my intended reader. And my intended reader for me is my husband. My husband's very picky about books. He's very plot focused. He's also very character focused. He knows when something sounds fishy and when it doesn't. And so I'll sit down, and you have to feel bad for him. You have to feel bad because my outlines are not like 2 pages. Like they're long. And the reason that I want to talk about it with my husband is, you know, other than the fact that he has really good ideas, is because remember how when I was talking about how when we write things it engages different parts of our brain. Same thing with conversation. It activates different parts of our brain, allows us to see something in a different perspective, and you know, it kind of helps me flesh out and make my story like a much more, I don't want to say tighter, that sounds weird. It makes my story feel a lot more solid than it could be. Sometimes he'll find plot holes that I just like totally overlooked. He's like, well, what about this thing? You've got this right here, and then what happens? I'm like, well, I don't know, just stuff. So once I get done talking to my intended reader about the outline and making sure that it's all good to go, I do the fifth thing, which is the to-do list. You know, all that research I mentioned earlier, I start doing it. And here's what I'm going to tell you about doing the research thing. Give yourself a due date for when you need to be done with all of it. The only reason I say this is because there's a person at my writing group who said they spent 10 years doing all the research for their book. So 10 years is a lot of time. That's definitely a lot of time that you're not writing your book. When you do your research, the one thing that I would really encourage you to keep in mind is that your book is not about your research. Your book is about your story. And so if you find yourself writing a whole bunch of descriptions about basically all the stuff that you spent a lot of time researching and trying to figure out, you're going to bore the fuck out of us. And that's the one thing that this person who at writing group keeps facing, because he did so much research for his story that he bores us to death when he starts talking about it. And we even have to tell them, like, you need to take that out. Like, that doesn't do anything for us. And he's like, well, I spent a lot of time researching this. And it's like, and we still don't care. You know, do enough to be accurate, but don't do enough where you're writing a textbook. The sixth step is where you actually go ahead and you start doing the writing for your novel. And however you want to have your outline with you, go ahead and do that. And I just want to let y'all know that I actually have like this little mini notebook that I have with me when I'm actually doing the outline. So that way I can kind of tick it off, or I can go back to it for a reference. Sometimes I write notes on the page, like little things like I know I'm going to have to go back and change. One of my friends keeps her outline in an Excel spreadsheet on her laptop that she refers back to. Somebody else just does like a little outline like on a sticky note and leaves it on the laptop, you know, when they're about to do it. Whatever works for you, there are no wrong answers for that. So the sixth thing, there is a sixth thing, and you would think that we would be done after actually writing it, but the reason I'm mentioning the sixth thing is because if you are like me and you're writing your book and things do change, it's really important to actually go back and correct your outline where it needs to be, because one of the things that you sometimes end up having to do is to give your outline to your editor. So I did cover the different ways to do outlines. I talked about my particular method. If any of you were interested in that little kind of like grid that you saw me share up here when I was talking about breaking down the scenes, I'd be more than happy to share that Google Sheets with you, and you can go ahead and make a copy and use it if it works for you. If you think it's overkill, you don't have to use it either. Since I only covered a couple of ways to do outlining, if you know that there's another outlining method, or I hate to say formula, but if you know of a formula that works better, you know, please feel free to go ahead and share it and tell us about why it's really good. I'm definitely the kind of person that likes to know more. Knowledge is power. Just knowing more resources or more approaches actually allows me to help other people when I'm trying to assist them in their own writing journey. That's it. That's all I have for you today. Please feel free to like and subscribe. I'd like to remind you all that I have a short story out. If you would like to see if I know what I'm talking about and judge me through it, please feel free. I've got a link down below. If it's only 99 cents, if you don't want to go ahead and purchase that, that's fine. Sign up for my newsletter. You get a free PDF copy. I would love for you to read it, and I would really be super grateful if you left a review for it. In the world of authoring, we are made or broken by the reviews that are left for us, and if sometimes I would rather have a bad review than no review at all. So if you would like to connect with me, I have my links down to social media below. If you would like to have a say in the future videos that are coming up, I always have a poll between 2 or 3 options on Saturday. You can go ahead and cast your vote and see what you want. If you would like to be aware when those videos come out, I've got a like and subscribe video down there. Ding the bell so that way you know when I have videos coming out. And yeah, I think I'm done talking today. That's my dog. Happy to